Hello, my name's Alex Ruck-Keene. I'm a barrister at 3rd and Essex Chambers, specialising in mental capacity and healthcare ethics. And what I'm doing here is providing a bit of a follow-up to some of the questions which were asked at the webinar I spoke at, or was one of the speakers at, on eating and drinking at acknowledged risk, held by the Royal College of Speech and Language Therapists in May 2024. We had a lot of questions come in. We answered as many as we could on the day, but we didn't manage to get to them all. So what I'm doing is picking up on some of the key themes of ones we didn't get to. I should say I very, very strongly recommend you watch this after you have watched a recording of the webinar. This is not really intended to be standalone, but really a follow-on. So one of the key sort of clusters of questions we were asked where people were sort of cogitating during the webinar about what the Court of Appeal had said in JJ and Spectrum about food and drink suddenly becoming medical treatment where the person was unable to administer it to themselves. I'm using the word administer to give the idea it suddenly starts being medical, because JJ couldn't physically transfer boiled sweets, crisps and biscuits into his mouth. Someone else had to do it for him. And the Court of Appeal said, well, the provision of food in that situation means it is medical treatment. If it's medical treatment, clinicians can't be compelled to provide it against their clinical conscience. And many people were sort of cogitating, thinking through, going, well, hang on a minute, does that apply across the board? Is that not a broader definition of medical treatment, of food as medical treatment than we previously understood? Because I think most people have been thinking, well, we understand that clinically assisted nutrition and hydration is medical treatment, but we hadn't really thought of biscuits as medical treatment. And as I said on the day, and to emphasize again, it's the fact that JJ couldn't do this for himself, which meant that somebody else was intervening. And it was that intervention which changed biscuits magically into medical treatment. And various people were saying, well, hang on, isn't this something which we could challenge? It's something which somebody could challenge in a different case. And one of the points that one might wish to make is this wasn't really the subject of argument before the Court of Appeal. JJ's representatives and the Trust's representatives weren't arguing about the definition of medical treatment. And somebody might want to say, well, were you really intending to capture absolutely everything? All sort of transmagrification of food into medical treatment. But that's what they said. And so I think we have to take that that is the starting point. So it's the fact the person can't physically do this for themselves, which means something. The provision of food, which many people might think is just basic care, suddenly becomes medical treatment. And that does have some considerable implications. One of the other things that people were saying is, well, does this also, and one thing people are saying, doesn't this feel discriminatory? You know, why should it be that the mere fact that JJ can't physically do this for himself, which sort of takes it from one category to another? Well, the reality is, it's not discrimination. Legally, it's differential treatment. JJ is being treated differently by the law because he's not physically able to do something. And discrimination is where there is unjustified differential treatment, and the court clearly weren't thinking this is discrimination, it's not unjustified. And the reason, if you want to think it through, is that they were struck by the fact that if JJ was physically able to do something for himself, as it were, the level of risk and the level of the risk aspiration, much of that would be on him. It would be him taking the food, putting it in his own mouth. Whereas if it is something being done by somebody else is very, very directly implicated in what is happening. And at the root of JJ's case was, if you've got two people directly implicated, the person who's receiving the thing and the person who's doing it, you do have to have regard to the rights and the position of the person actually doing the thing. And then lots of people said, well, what about the situation where this food is being provided by family members? Does that still mean it's medical treatment? I think it's a little bit difficult to answer that question in the abstract. But I think one way I might want to do is sort of divide this down into two things. One is a situation where family members are supporting somebody to eat and drink in a JJ type scenario with no knowledge of speech and language therapy, no knowledge of clinicians. It's, as it were, completely outside a framework where this is being thought through as part of a plan. that feels, and I suspect the courts will feel, that was rather different to a situation where the family members were being seen as part of the plan. And I think the courts would be saying, well, somebody needs to have oversight of that plan, and the plan, who is holding the risk on the plan, the courts are going to be looking to somebody on the clinical side, rather more, I anticipate, than on the family member side. But you might still have a situation where one family member says, I'm willing to support, and another family member is saying, I simply am not willing to support. I think it's so risky. I'm really concerned that if I do this, that he will choke. Obviously, at that point, a family member would not be wouldn't be subject to the same sort of regulatory stuff as, for instance, a nurse or a clinical professional who provided food to somebody who then choked, because they're not subject to CQC regulation in England or equivalent regulation in Scotland or Wales. But theoretically, a family member who provided an individual with food where they were at very, very high known choking risk, theoretically, but I think it's really theoretical, that family member could be at risk of being investigated for gross negligence manslaughter. As I say, I think it's really very theoretical. And what the courts would be looking much more to is the sort of stuff I was talking about in the webinar, which is, has everybody involved sat down and thought this through properly and thought about, has the risk been lowered as much as is reasonably possible? And if you've got a family member who's going, I just am really, really concerned about, is there a workaround to enable other people to deliver that support? And if you have family members saying, I am really, really concerned about the feeding taking place at all, I know that's what X wants, but I'm really concerned about the risk of choking. Has there been a way in which to resolve that? And that might well involve taking legal advice. So capacity came up as a big issue. JJ had unimpaired decision-making capacity, so it was his physical abilities which were an issue. If he'd lacked the capacity to make the relevant decisions, and everyone was thinking this through from a best interest basis, really very, very similar things apply. But everybody is trying to think through, I'm trying to support this person to achieve the best quality of life in line with their known wishes, feelings, beliefs and values, using the language of the Mental Capacity Act in England and Wales. But there may be situations where it just seems too risky. After a proper analysis, and it's not possible to reduce that risk to a level that everyone can live with, at that point, well, then is one having to think about, well, how can one think this through? But against a backdrop of, ultimately, if the risk is considered too high after really having thought it through in an NGT way, no one can be compelled to provide it. Conversely, if everyone really has thought it through and the risk is being lowered as low as reasonably possible, really careful consideration of the person's known wishes and feelings in relation to being fed in acknowledged risk reduction done properly, proper recorded best interest decision. One would like to think, but the really frustrating thing post JJ, my frustration probably came through as part of the in the webinar. One would like to think that would be perfectly acceptable. But if in doubt, it is possible to go to the Court of Protection and say, this is the plan, we really think this is the right thing to do. Please, Court of Protection, can you, on the individual's behalf, say, I would like it. If the person has capacity, the Court of Protection is not an option. The Court of Protection is only think about situations where people lack capacity. It would theoretically be possible to go to the High Court. Please go and talk to your legal advisors about this in England and Wales and get a declaration that providing food in the way which causes a serious risk of aspiration is nonetheless something which is so closely in line with what the person wants. All the risks have been reduced as best as possible. Could the court please confirm that's acceptable? I can't guarantee a court will give that, because the court sometimes is concerned about giving, and I used in the webinar the phrase get out of jail free, but there at least people have done everything they can to run the case for properly patient-centred care. Just in terms of getting to court, we had a couple of questions about that. It is possible to get to the court 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. They do not want you to go to court on Christmas Eve if actually you've known about the situation for 3 weeks in advance. They need proper time to think, and the person to get proper representation if they don't have capacity. there was quite a sort of a cluster around who holds risk, who makes decisions. And I think it's, and this is particularly in the context of people lacking capacity, but also more generally. And I couldn't answer the question directly in the webinar, and I can't answer the question directly now, because it's going to depend. It's going to depend on all the various teams involved, all the various people involved. But the critical thing is, where we have a situation where this has been overseen, and we've now got post JJ administration of food and drink in circumstances of acknowledged risk, where the person themselves isn't physically capable of transferring the food into their own mouth, then at that point, it is medical treatment, and one needs to have a properly thought out plan, MDT plan, thought about plan, with someone holding that, saying, I am accountable. Within that, the voices of everybody who have got proper expertise need to be heard. I'm particularly thinking of speech and language therapists. I'm also, of course, thinking where the person themselves is able to speak. They're immensely important, if not the most important person. Family members, friends, where the person is unable to speak for themselves, but the voices need to be properly heard. There needs to be proper agreement about the way forward. If there isn't proper agreement, please go and seek legal advice to try and tease it out and to work out, is there a way in which to resolve the disagreement? Do we need to go and find some way of getting this resolved? Then one very last question I do just want to answer, although it's slightly unrelated, it's just, it comes up so often, I just wanted to make sure that I'd really covered it off. And somebody said they'd just been on basic life support training, and the person delivering training identified if a patient deteriorates via cardiac arrest, then if they've got a do not attempt CPR recommendation, it stands. If the patient chokes on food and then goes into pulmonary arrest, the DNA CPR doesn't stand because the choking incident is a reversible event. He then asked, I think it's a he, or the person then asking the question said, would JJ's DNA CPR still stand in the event of a choking incident, or is DNA CPR in place in case he chokes? The reason I just wanted to touch on this for two reasons. One, JJ did not have a DNA CPR recommendation in place, or if he did, it wasn't recorded in the judgment. And I just wanted to alight on this to make clear the real difference between a DNA CPR recommendation, a clinical recommendation, that in the event the person goes into cardiac arrest, it's unlikely to be the right thing to do to try and restart pulmonary CPR, cardiopulmonary circulation. That's a DNA CPR clinical decision, clinical recommendation versus advanced decision to refuse treatment. That's what JJ had done. He had made an advanced decision to refuse interventions in the event he choked. And I think that was one of the things that really troubled the Court of Protection, was he was saying, you are not allowed to help me even if I appear to be choking. And that was one of the things that's really troubled them. Had he had a DNA CPR recommendation in place, because, for instance, it a properly considered a thought process had been gone through that, for instance, if he went into cardiac arrest, his particular condition meant that CPR would be unlikely to be successful. If he choked, it might well be the case that the DNA CPR recommendation should simply not be followed, because actually the choking was entirely reversible and it was entirely easy to address that. So I just wanted to pick up on that to draw out the distinction between DNA CPR, clinical recommendation. Always have to think about, actually at the point where the person goes into arrest, what is the right thing to do, guided by the DNA CPR recommendation, if it's being properly thought about, versus ADRT, the person's own decision to refuse. So thanks very much indeed for watching this sort of follow-up set of questions, but please, I can't reiterate enough, these are not meant to be standalone, they are picking up on things which were asked in the original webinar.